Good afternoon, everybody. It's Pastor Ty. We're doing our recap of Sunday's sermon on Mark chapter 11, 1 through 11. And we ended up titling this sermon, It's Him, It's Time, and It's Here, Part 2. For those of you who have been with us from the very onset of this series at the beginning of the year, you might recall that the first sermon we gave on the first, I think, 15 or 16 verses of Mark was called It's Him, It's Time, and It's Here. And so what we started with on Sunday was this, very common storytelling technique, in media res, the idea that like we're in the midst of things, right? And so one of the things we talked about was, imagine Quentin Tarantino decides to make a movie on Jesus. One of his common devices in his cinematic storytelling experiences is he gives to the viewer a in the middle of the scenario introduction, and then from there starts at the beginning and moves back to where it started. And so you almost get the impression that if Tarantino were to do the Gospel of Mark, Sunday's passage might have been actually where he chose to begin. And so we called Sunday's sermon It's Him, It's Time, and It's Here, Part 2, because in so many ways what we experience in Mark 11 parallels what occurred in Mark chapter 1. We just have a new setting. So instead of Galilee, instead of northern Israel, we're now in Jerusalem. Jesus is entering Jerusalem, and all of these key catalytic moments that started Mark kind of occur all over again, only now it's in Mark chapter 11 and it's in a different situation. So instead of Jesus being baptized in the wilderness and then taken out for his temptation, now Jesus is entering Jerusalem, and he has a sort of a different form of isolation, and that's what we're going to talk about today. On the way into Jerusalem, the gospel writer Mark mentions two little hamlets, two little towns that Jesus would have walked through. He talks about Bethphage. I mispronounced that in the last video. So obvious where my prowess is in the ancient Greek, not much. Bethphage, house of unripe figs, and then Bethany, house of dates, are also known as the house of misery. And so one of the things we talked about at the beginning of the sermon on Sunday was this idea of why it's important symbolically and spiritually that Jesus walked through the house of unripe figs and the house of misery on his way into Jerusalem. And one of the more practical spiritual ways we kind of examined this text on Sunday was this idea that Jesus entered Jerusalem very similarly to how he enters so many human lives. Jerusalem was unprepared for Jesus's arrival. Jerusalem was unripe. You get this especially in Luke's gospel, where Jesus is actually weeping as he walks into Jerusalem, or as he rides into Jerusalem, knowing that so many people just don't understand his arrival and what he is there to do, and how close salvation is to them. And so on one hand, what we said is that as Israel's as ready for their Messiah as many of us were when we were saved. And I know my personal salvation story is, the day I was saved, I actually tried to skip church that day. And so it's ironic that on a day where I was actually trying to actively avoid going to church, I end up saved by Christ. And so there's this understanding of unripeness that precedes the ripening of salvation, and that we are all deeply unripe in and of ourselves, and that if it weren't for the ripening movement of God in our lives, we'd be unripe. And so it makes total sense that Jesus walks through the house of unripe figs, because aren't we all? And then the second thing, this idea of Bethany, the house of misery, and why that's important. It's because to recognize that Mark slows down in his gospel in chapters 11 through 16. He spends 6 chapters on a week of Jesus's life versus the first 10 chapters being on effectively 3 years. Why? Well, because it speaks to just how saturated and rich and significant this final week of Christ's life was, and how so much is culminating in this short period of time. And so we talked about how the manner by which Jesus will save us over the course of this week is going to be a miserable affair. Jesus is going to be betrayed. Promises are going to be unkept. Slander toward Christ is going to occur. He is going to be tormented. He is going to be rejected in the ultimate sense. and he's going to die. And all of this is going to be experienced by Christ effectively in isolation and in a short period of time. And so you get the impression that he has to walk through the house of unripe figs, and he has to walk through the house of misery, if he is going to do for us what he has come to do. And so that gets us to this manner by which Christ is brought into Jerusalem on a colt that had never been ridden on. And we noticed on the sermon this past Sunday how there are moments in the Old Testament where animals that had never been used for labor before were set apart for significant experiences. So in Numbers chapter 19, you get the snapshot of an animal that had never been used for labor being set aside for purification. And in Deuteronomy 21, you get an animal being set aside for the purposes of atoning sacrifice. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 6, you get a couple of animals being set aside for transport of the Ark of the Covenant, which embodies the presence of God. And so what we have today in the text, when we're examining Mark 11, verses 1 through 11, is we have the collision of purification, atoning sacrifice, and transport of God's presence all happening in this moment. Jesus is our purification. Jesus is our atoning sacrifice. And as such, he has to enter and be transported in like fashion. And so in all of these cases, whether it's purification, atonement, or transport in the Old Testament, all of these things must occur via an animal that has not been used. And so when Jesus, who is our purification, he is our atonement, enters Jerusalem, he has to enter by such a way. It makes perfect sense. And so there you have it. And then, of course, recognizing that Jesus's entrance into Jerusalem in the manner that he entered, that he came on the foal of a donkey, a colt, is significant because it shows that Christ's initial entrance into Jerusalem is one of making of peace, that Christ is establishing the opportunity, the entrance into true shalom, true peace, that he doesn't come yet to make war, but he comes bringing with him salvation. He's actually cutting off the chariot from Ephraim, as Zechariah 9 said. He's taking out the war horse from Jerusalem. Jesus brings peace, not war. Jesus brings freedom from the oppression that comes out of us, not oppression that comes from us externally. Christ will come back to make war at a different time. That's what is yet to come. That is what will happen when he returns to the earth. But in this first time, he comes as the Passover lamb. And as such, they sang as Christ entered a Passover psalm. You'll recognize that this Hosanna, Hosanna procession that flanked Christ as he entered is reminiscent of Psalm 118, which is a Passover psalm. It's a Hallel psalm. And you'll notice, if you're a very careful student of the word, that this is what's called a chiastic structure, an ABBA structure. And it's also antiphonal. I don't know if any of you have any old school church experience, but those hymns where the choir would sing part of it and then the audience would sing part of it and then vice versa. So here, as Jesus enters Jerusalem, you have this chiastic structure and this antiphonal singing. So you've got one group singing Hosanna, that's the A, and then you have another group singing Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that's B, and then blessed is the coming of the kingdom of our father David, that's another B, followed finally by another A, Hosanna in the highest. So A, B, B, A. And so as Jesus enters Jerusalem, they're not necessarily praising, they're pleading, they're crying out Hosanna, which means save us. And so what you find then is this fascinating scenario where, as Jesus enters humbly on a donkey to make peace, he comes in this way because so many people don't understand why exactly Jesus comes in the first place. And John MacArthur had such an incredible point about this moment in the scriptures, because he called this the false coronation of the true king. Jesus is the true king, but this coronation he receives as he enters Jerusalem is false. It doesn't measure up to his status, to his greatness. Here's the quote continued. Coronations aren't humble. They aren't unexpected. They aren't unplanned. They aren't unofficial. They aren't spontaneous. They aren't superficial. They aren't temporary. But this one was all of those. And so you get the impression as Jesus enters Jerusalem that this is surely not the true coronation of King Jesus. Jesus received his heavenly coronation when he ascended to the Father and sat at his right hand. And Jesus will experience his true earthly coronation when he returns. And that is what we find in Revelation chapter 19. And notice that in Revelation 19, behold, that is when Jesus will put himself upon a white horse. And that is when Jesus will make war, but not yet. And then finally, we recognize this sort of this climactic, pregnant with more to come scenario at the end here. We're told that Jesus's first entrance into Jerusalem is what's the word? The exclamation point of this passage is that Jesus enters the temple and has a look around. And you get the impression from Malachi 3, verse 1, that Jesus comes to inspect the purity of worship at the temple therein. And Jesus's silence is quite telling. If you're a careful student, you know what it's like to experience deafening silence that is tied to judgment. And so as Jesus exits Jerusalem and goes back into retreat at Bethany, back into isolation, right? So if he was baptized and then into the wilderness, and now Jesus is plunged into Jerusalem and then back out to Bethany, you know that what comes next is Jesus is going to open his mouth and he's going to speak. And surely what he has to say to those at the temple is not going to be positive. And so buckle up. Next week will be fun. We will be back with our sermon preview on Mark 11, 12 through 26 on Thursday. Until then, God bless you.